few weeks ago, I made a video comparing pixel shift and regular scans, but I made two severe errors. So I took the video down, and that has led to this video, Pixel Shift Scanning 2 Electric Boogaloo. Read it. So there were two issues with the first version of this video. The first was that my OBS recording was botched and looked like ass when I upscaled the recording from 1440p to 4K in Resolve, but that was a minor glitch compared to the big one. So in the video for the single shot scans, I forgot to disable the default sharpening. So if you don't know, digital cameras add metadata to the RAW files that editors like Lightroom read and use. Things like the white balance, lens corrections, and in the case for this video, a default sharpening amount is added by default for normal images. Now, because pixel shift is a combination of raw files into one big files, there may not have been default sharpening applied like this, so it wasn't a fair comparison for the different scans. So to fix the issues, I removed the sharpening from all the files and I've exported them as TIFFs to use directly in Resolve, so the one-to-one comparison will be much better when viewed in 4K. So the goal of this test is to compare two scanning methods, a single shot scan and a high-res, downscaled pixel shift scan. Now the idea behind using pixel shift scanning is to eliminate the approximation caused by the Bayer filter to increase the color resolution of the scan and to use a higher resolution mode to gather as much information as possible from the film. So if you aren't aware, in a digital camera, in the CMOS sensor, each photosite or pixel can only measure the amount of light hitting it. It cannot tell what color the light is. So to get around this, the sensor is covered in a special color filter called a Bayer filter that only allows each pixel to see either red, green or blue light. Then with this limited color information, the camera uses algorithms and maths to fill in the blanks and create a full color photograph. So why could this be an issue in scanning? Well, the algorithms for this debayering process were designed for normal photography because that's what cameras are for. You know, taking pictures of normal things like deer, pagodas, and little Timmy crashing and burning off of his first bike. So I think this debayering process can affect film scanning due to the fact that film is a perfect random noise pattern of grain or dyes in the film, and you cannot accurately recreate this pattern from the limited information captured in a single shot scan. It will make mistakes, and I think this causes the grain to be enhanced as smaller grains in the film may get merged into larger chunks as the software guesses what should be in between each color in the blank spaces of the image. So how pixel shift gets us around this problem is by taking multiple photos and moving the sensor one pixel at a time for each shot. This allows each spot to be covered by a red, green and a blue pixel to give full color information for each pixel. Another trick a camera can use is to move the sensor by a half pixel distance, and this can effectively quadruple the sensor resolution, which is very handy for making high resolution scans of larger formats like 6x9 or 4x5. So for this test I used a GFX 100S to scan multiple frames on different formats. The first scan was a standard single shot scan, from which I then removed the sharpening, cropped the image and I exported it as a TIFF. I also took a 16 shot pixel shift scan of each frame, combined them in Fuji's software to make a DNG. This DNG was then cropped in Lightroom, removed the sharpening and I exported it as a TIFF as well. Then I took all these TIFF files and downscaled them using ImageMagick and the Landsross, I don't even know how to pronounce it, but Landsross filter to downscale the image to a common size. I did this because 400 megapixel scans, which is what the GFX pixel shift can do, is way too much for different film sizes. So for 35mm scans, I downscaled them to 45 megapixels. I chose this because it is the most optimistic reading of the numbers for Fuji Velvia, is about 40 megapixels of resolution, so I left 5 megapixels for cropping and borders. For medium format, I used about 80 megapixels for 6x6 and 645 and about 90 megapixels for 6x9. And then I used the full 100 megapixels for 4x5 scans. So the general idea here is to see if overscanning at a high resolution and then downscaling will give better results than a single shot scan. Now for all of my shots I use my scanning frame, which is a very solid stand and holds the film and camera perfectly flat and parallel. As for the lenses I used the Scanner Nikkor 8000 lens, which is an amazing lens for 35mm, and for medium format and large formats I used an APO Rotagon 2x 75mm f4.5 lens. This lens gives much better scans for larger formats as the scanner lens is super optimized for 1:1, meanwhile the larger lens handles shrinking down the larger formats to a smaller sensor much better. Now before I get into comparing the images, I need to address the topic of sharpness versus detail because they're very different concepts. Philip Bloom has a great video on this which I've linked down below. So when it comes to sharpness, it can make an image ping more and trick you into thinking that there is more detail. It's entirely possible to have a lower detail, high sharpness shot look at first glance like it has more detail, but it actually doesn't. It's just the edge sharpness masking the lack of detail. This seagull pic is an example of this, where the left image is actually less detailed than the right, but it might look sharper. Now if you look at the tongue, you can see the smaller details on the right, while it's blocky from over sharpening on the left. Now both of these images are 24 megapixel, the right is a pixel shift and the left is from a Z6. But you can see very clearly how the extra edge sharpness is only masking the lack of detail and is not actually revealing more information or more detail being captured. So if you're going to do a comparison like this, you do need to be very aware of the difference between detail and sharpness, as they are different things. So to make this very clear, my main concern in this video is how detailed the image is and how the grain is rendered. Now the reason I'm looking into this for pixel shift is because I have found that camera scanning actually really exaggerates the grain and can make images look a lot more grainy than they are. Now I think the pixel shift scans will have less grain, and I'm particularly interested in how the scans respond to editing and particular sharpening in post. So with that, let's take a look at some images. Now for all of these images, the one-shot scan is on the left and the pixel shift scan is on the right. So this first image was taken on Delta 3200, and we can see looking at the full scans there's very little difference, but at 100% we can see that the grain is finer and less jagged on the pixel shift scan. We can see a difference around the beak where it transitions from the beak into background with the softer, smoother grain. Now if we turn up the sharpening on both of these scans to 50%, we can see that the pixel shift scan is actually holding up a lot better and the grain is not nearly as enhanced as the single shot scan. So the second image was taken on CMS22 at Miyajima, and with this being such a fine-grained film, the difference is a lot smaller to no real difference I can even see at 100%. At 200%, maybe there's a hair of a difference, but to be honest with this one, there's only so many times I can split hairs. So this seagull image, which was shot on Ektachrome E100, is quite interesting because the main difference appears to be how smooth the sky is. The pixel shift scan appears to have less color noise in the sky. Now when the sharpening was dialed up on this, the difference became a little bit bigger, but not too much more. I'm chalking this up to how fine-grained E100 is. So image 4 here of the station was shot on 500T and was quite interesting because the pixel shift scan seems to have helped out the shadow areas quite a bit. If we take a look at 100% at the train car, it seems that the pixel shift scan has less kind of white noise and seems to have less noise in the shadow areas overall. But if we move up to the bricks and the chimney, it seems that the pixel shift squeaked out a hair more fine detail for each block in this scan as well. So our fifth image is a picture of a swan on Kodak Gold 200, and this is a good example of the differences we would be looking for. If we take a look at the beak on the pixel shift scan, it seems to be a lot more uniform in color and have a lot less of the white noise from the grain. And in particular this area under the neck, the color is a lot more even as well and not as grainy with that weird whiteness. Now when we turn the sharpening up on this, it's the same story, with the pixel shift scan looking a lot cleaner with less of that white grain noise compared to the single shot scan. So the next image was shot on Portra 160 and is of a temple in Nanzoin near Fukuoka. And in this one we can see again how that pixel shift has a lot less of that white blocky texture in the grain, and the shadow area under the roof is less crunchy. It also seems that the bricks on the bottom are better defined in the pixel shift scan, but that could just be a weird quirk, it's very slight. Now if you compare the sharpened images, again we can see how the single shot grain is enhanced more than the pixel shift scan's grain. So let's step it up to 645 format with this Lomo 800 shot of a seagull. Now with no sharpening applied, there's actually not much difference between the two. The pixel shift might have a touch less grain rendering, but it seems to be minimal. However, when you look at the sharpened scans, we can see how the beak gets that sharpened grain look with all the white kind of fuzziness compared to the pixel shift, which is much more even. So if we step it up again to the 6x6 format with some gold 200 photos of some cherry blossoms. Now this is interesting because it seems at this point the higher res of the pixel shift is able to squeak out a hair more detail in the flower stems. It also appears that the grain is a hair smoother as well. And once we turn up the sharpening again, this becomes even more obvious with the grain getting harsher on a single shot scan compared to the pixel shift. And we're going to see the same thing again, I think, on some Portrait 160 shot on 6x6 with this image of my two friends looking identical. But if we zoom in on the Adidas logo, you can see that the pixel shift is a hair more defined, along with kind of the strings and the textures in the fabric of the hoodie. Now if we take a look at the sharpened images, single shot actually has that digitally sharpened grain again. While the pixel shift seems to have less of that sharpened grain effect, and it seems to enhance the detail in the hoodie texture after sharpening. So let's step this up again to some Velvia 100 and 6x9 format with this image of Kyo Mizudera. And we can see that the pixel shift scan seems to be resolving the pagoda a little better, particularly on that sort of antenna thing sticking out the top, and the trees seem to be a hair more defined. Now it does seem here that the sharpened images show a little less grain with the pixel shift scan compared to the single shot scan. So let's continue with the Velvia 100 in 6x9 format with this shot of Fushuni Inari, and it looks the same in different formats, but at 100% we can see that the pixel shift appears to be pulling a hair more detail in the vertical writing, and the grain in the white area seems to be more defined and looks more like grain rather than digital noise on the pixel shift scan. The sharpened images do show this difference a little more, and with less sharpening on the grain in the white areas on the pixel shift version. And then we come to our final image where we're going to step it up to 4x5, which was shot on Delta 100. And if you look at the 100% pixel shift scan, it very clearly shows that there's more detail around the tower and the hill and the bushes on the hill. Now when we look at the sharpened images, the graininess seems to jump up a lot in the single shot scan, more than I thought it would, and it seems to be really obvious in the sky around the tower, where the grain is a lot more enhanced on the single shot than on the pixel shift. So after looking at all these images, is pixel shift scanning worth it? Yes, but for most no. If you're just posting to Instagram and making small prints, honestly, at that point, it's just not worth it. The main difference for me is how the grain appears to be rendered a bit smoother on the pixel shift scans, particularly on the smaller formats in 35mm. Also, it seems to me that the extra information gathered using pixel shift results in a file that can handle a lot more in the editing, particularly in sharpening without enhancing the grain too much. It also seems that from this small sample and playing with these files, that when I was inverting the color negatives, it was more reliable in the pixel shift and gave better results. Now this is something I can't really test, and it's something I just kind of observed, but it does make sense because the pixel shift scans will give a lot more color information for each pixel compared to a normal raw file. Now our soft monkey eyes are terrible at seeing color, so we're not going to see this. But the mathematical precision of software, and any tiny errors in the input after an inversion would actually create quite large errors in the output. So I do think that the extra color information might be better for inversions. Now another advantage of pixel shift scans is that you can actually get very high resolution files in a single capture, which can be very useful for larger formats like 6x9 or 6x17 or 4x5 large formats, because if you're doing multiple scans and stitching things together in post, it can actually be quite a pain in the ass to get it all to work. And oddly, that is actually one of the main advantages of using a scanner like an Epson V850. Larger formats can be scanned without running into the limitations of a sensor in a camera, but it seems that the high-res pixel shift modes can actually help alleviate this limitation of camera scanning. So then, with all these advantages, why do I say it's not worth it? Well, this is starting to get really deep into the realm of diminishing returns. As you push the limits in one area, like the camera, other issues start to come to light, like the lenses you need to be able to resolve details at this level, and how steady your stand is, and how perfectly flat the film needs to be. Every little tiny error gets amplified tenfold when scanning like this. But it does produce some really nice files. However, there's only so many times you can split a hair when it comes to this. So if you're planning to go down this path, just know that this kind of scanning, it leads to madness. And that's all I've got to say on the matter. So with that, it's the end of this video. See you next time. I should have worn a darker t-shirt, not one that shows up every fucking drop of sweat under the sun. That has now been blasted away with the fan in the window, so great decision.